because this might be the inner chronicle of what we are, and we have to articulate ourselves, otherwise we would be cows in a field.
Welcome to Cows in the Field. This is a show in which we discuss philosophical themes in popular films. My name is Justin.
I'm Laura.
And today we try to undermine one another's capabilities for rational thought. That's right. It's George Cukor's Gaslight.
It was written 2 days before she was murdered.
Where did you find that?
In this score, she must have left it here. It's written by somebody called Sergius Bauer.
Give it to me.
He said I wasn't any liquor. He said I was going out of my mind.
You're not going out of your mind. You're slowly and systematically being driven out of your mind.
But why? Why? Oh, that's wonderful.
And you thought I was being cruel to you. Keeping people away
not
from
cruel.
you. Making you a prisoner.
Oh, you're the kindest man in the world. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
And joining us on the show we have a very special guest, Joseph McBride. Joseph is a film historian and professor in the School of Cinema at San Francisco State University. He's authored biographies of Frank Capra, John Ford, Steven Spielberg, and written 3 books about Orson Welles, as well as critical studies of Ernst Lubitsch, Billy Wilder, and the Coen brothers. Most recently, he's the author of George Cukor's People, Acting for a Master Director. Welcome to the show, Joseph.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be with you.
Well, we're very excited to have you here, and we're going to be talking about Gaslight. But before we do that, I want to just start with, you're a film historian and a scholar, but you've lived a very exciting and fascinating life. And I want to know what led you to write a book on George Cukor.
Well, part of it is I've just admired his work for a long time. A Star is Born, which he made with the Judy Garland version. It's one of the greatest films ever made, in my view. It was back in 1972, I was thinking of writing a whole book about Star is Born. I've always wanted to write a book about a film, which I haven't quite done yet. But I didn't get interest in that from the British Film Institute. But that was in 71, I wrote my first piece on Cukor. It was a book review of another book on Cukor, and I was kind of talking about how difficult it is for critics to express the qualities that Cukor brings to his work. And let me just quote Francois Truffaut, who, as a young critic, he wrote a review of A Life of Her Own, which is one of Cukor's more obscure films, but Truffaut wrote that this admirable film displays the beauty of Cukor's work, that extraordinary man who makes out of every 5 films one masterpiece, 3 other very good ones, and the 5th still interesting. And Truffaut, when he reviewed the 1954 Cukor film, It Should Happen to You, he wrote, "The trouble is that Cukor isn't the kind of director you write about. He's someone to talk about with friends on the street or sitting in a cafe." So I set out to kind of, it's a challenge from Truffaut. How do you write about Cukor? It's a challenge because Cukor was a great actors director. To me, the greatest actors directors in the cinema are Orson Welles, Cukor, Ingmar Bergman, Max Ophuls, and Elia Kazan. I would put them all in that group. And writing about acting is not something that is done a lot in film criticism or film history. And he's also a conundrum for auteurist critics or even non-auteur critics, because he worked through his actors, and he freely admitted that. And he also believed very strongly in fidelity to the text. He was not the kind of director who would say, I really wrote my own films. And he influenced the screenwriters. He worked with them, on developing the films and coming up with ideas, et cetera. But he often adapted plays, usually plays, not novels, once in a while a novel. But the Writers Guild of America, which I'm a member of, around 1980 gave Cukor an award for his treatment of writers. And this, in my view, is a unique award. I was there when we gave him this award. It was wonderful because he had such respect for writers, both screenwriters and the original source writers. And he wasn't running around saying, it's my, it's all my work, etc., which really hurt the career of, say, Frank Capra, who alienated screenwriters because he started claiming too much credit for their work and they wouldn't work with him anymore. And Howard Hawks, who I did an interview book with, I asked him, in some of his early films, he took a writing credit and then he stopped doing that. And I said, why don't you take a writing credit? Because I know you work on the scripts with the writers. And he said, because if I did, I couldn't get such good writers to work with me. Such a smart comment. And Hawks his ego was strong enough. He didn't need to claim he did it all.
Yeah.
So Cukor was a deferential and modest man, but a very strong-handed director. He had a lot of control of his work. He had a lot of influence in the studio days. He was a great product of the studio system. There were some setbacks, but generally he got some of the best properties and the best stars, and the films are beautifully designed, etc. And as his work went on, he became more and more visually adept. He came from the theater, and it took him a while to learn about visual style, and he loved doing research into periods and settings, and his films became more and more visually sumptuous over the years. And so my opening is a question about, is he an auteur and why does that matter? So I'm wrestling with that. And one of the big misconceptions about the auteur theory, which is in dispute with, it's been a controversial theories from the beginning. The French critics, Truffaut and others, created what they called the politique des auteurs, which meant the policy of authors. And they meant they were writing seriously about people who they respected and not about people they didn't respect. And it was designed actually for directors who didn't write their own films and weren't obviously authors in the literary sense, but it was making the point that visual style is a form of writing or authorship. And when the theory, when this was translated to America by Andrew Sarris, great critic, he called it the auteur theory. And that was a little stronger. And it led to the misconception, even though Sarris didn't make this point, that you're only an auteur if you write your own scripts,
Right.
like Woody Allen or Ingmar Bergman or Orson Welles or somebody. But Sarris wrote about great directors who didn't write their own scripts or didn't obviously write their own scripts. I mean, Hitchcock and Lubitsch didn't get writing credit, but they always worked on the scripts. But authorship is there's a great visual component, and it's working with collaborators too. And Cukor was a great believer in collaboration. I edited 2 volumes of American Film Institute seminars, and my epigraph was from Alan Pakula, the director, who said, the worst thing about movies is that they're collaborative art form, and the best thing about movies is that they're a collaborative art form.
Yeah,
it's kind of a double-edged sword. How you work with your collaborators is very important, and do you respect them? So Cukor chose to work primarily through the actors, but his visual style was at the service of the actors. It didn't call attention to itself in the way that some directors do, but he loved long takes, for example, long, 5-minute takes, 6-minute takes, 7-minute takes, wonderfully complex blends of camera work and blocking and acting. And so I set out to find a vocabulary to write about Cukor's the actors in his films. This book is rather experimental because I write about the actors' performances. I took about 65, I think, of his most interesting actors and performances to write about stars and also character actors like Thelma Ritter, Hattie McDaniel, people like that. And I think I found it easier to write than I thought. I thought it might be difficult, but I had a lot of background in it because I was a screenwriter. I worked with actors, and I wrote 5 AFI Life Achievement Award shows. I got to work with all kinds of great actors from the golden era, and I did the rehearsals of the actors. And as a screenwriter, I worked with actors, and then I reviewed a lot of plays for Variety as well as films, and I was on the sets of many films watching directors work with actors. And I had the rare experience for a critic of acting for 5 years in an Orson Welles film, The Other Side of the Wind. through a series of fascinating, lucky breaks, I got into that film in 1970 when I was 23, and I played a spoof of myself as an earnest young film critic, and that was really my film school. And
Yeah.
I watched him direct a very wide range of people, from Oscar winners to younger actors to amateurs like myself. And the key thing about being a great actors director is directing everybody differently. And I'll just tell you one little anecdote. Hank Worden, who is the eccentric character actor who people love from The Searchers, who played old Mose. He was in several Ford films, and he also was in John Wayne's The Alamo. Wayne directed that. So I said, "What's the difference between Ford and Wayne as directors?" And he said, "Oh, well, Ford bullied Wayne. He yelled at him a lot, but Wayne was a tough guy, and he always took it, and he wasn't fazed by it, and it helped his performances. But Wayne thought that that's how you direct actors. You yell at everybody indiscriminately." And Hank said, "I'm a sensitive kind of guy, and if people yell at me, I kind of freeze up." And he said, "I'm not really good in The Alamo because I'm too tense." But he said, "Ford treated me like a baby, and that's what a great director does."
One of the things that I want to pick up, one of the threads I want to pick up on, of course, we can talk about many of the things you mentioned in your response, but is Q-core, as you talk about, is difficult for a lot of critics to write about, especially critics working within the quote unquote auteur theory framework, where we're looking for the things that are sort of distinctive as the author of the film, and we're looking for the author of the film. And as you mentioned, film is a collaborative medium. So I think what's really important about this is the ontology of film is very different from the ontology of these other artworks. So for one, to contrast films and plays. So with plays, we have the sort of the primary source of or author of the play is just the person who wrote the play itself, wrote the script. Then there's the staging of the play. This is a different thing, and the director's role is to stage the performance of the play. In film, it's almost the reverse, right? The script is the skeleton with which then the director comes in and uses as like a little bit like a blueprint for an architect, but then they sort of have to now oversee the construction of the thing, which is the building. And I think this leads a lot of people, myself included, to be confused as to who the actual author of the film is. And I think this leads to these confusions stemming in the auteur theory of wanting to give the director sort of credit only insofar as they have exercised total control over every dimension, including the script. And I think it's so interesting, as you point out, that Q-core is directing other people's scripts, and his style is much less pronounced, and where he's working stylistically is coming through his actors. So maybe we could talk a little bit about that, about how he worked with actors, sort of, and your research in the book being primarily through his actors, some of the choices that he made, and what the role of the director in directing an actor is to.
Yeah. Well, and I'll just make another point. Billy Wilder said once that the success or failure of a film is determined in the first 6 seconds. He said that's when you get the idea to make the film, or you choose to make the film. He said basically that's it. I mean, you do your best to make it work, but that determines everything, whether it's a hit or a failure. And Cooper, chose projects. Sometimes he was assigned projects, but he had a lot of autonomy. He got some of the best projects, like plays like Holiday, Philadelphia Story, Gaslight, and Little Women was a great novel that he adapted, and Sylvia Scarlett was a kind of an unusual novel that he made a wonderful film of. But he had great material. But he did, Ingmar Bergman said, what makes a great director is having a personal vision. And I would argue that Cukor had a personal vision, and he didn't have to write the scripts because he chose material that he found congenial, and he helped make it congenial. I mean, one of the most obvious things about his fascination with certain stories is the Pygmalion Galatea theme.
Mm-hmm.
A mentor who shapes somebody's life or career, and he returns to that a lot, and he finds a lot of variations on it, and sometimes there are dark dimensions to it, as in the Greek myth. And My Fair Lady, which is the first Cukor film that I loved. It meant a lot to me when I was in high school. I saw it 5 times in a beautiful big theater downtown in Milwaukee, and that's based on Pygmalion, the Shaw play, and that's explicitly about that kind of relationship. So, and he finds many other themes. He was a partly closeted gay director, and by that I mean everybody in Hollywood knew he was gay, and they accepted that. But he didn't talk about it publicly until very late in his life. He gave an interview to The Advocate, the gay publication, and more or less came out. But even then, he was kind of oblique about it. And but his films reflect his queer sensibility. He said, by the way, he didn't like the word gay. He liked the word queer. That he was ahead of his time in rehabilitating that word. And there's a fascination with gender performance. You know, the modern idea that gender is a performance and has social dimensions, and gender fluidity, as we call it now. He was into that way back in the 30s, you know. And his characters are rich because partly they explored both the male and female dimensions of people like Sylvia Scarlett. That's a film in which Katharine Hepburn goes in disguise as a boy, and she's ironically more relaxed as a boy than she is as a girl. And Hepburn herself was bisexual, and when she was growing up, she called herself Jimmy, and she said, I lived as a boy and I was never comfortable as a girl. And Cukor made 10 films with Katharine Hepburn, exploring aspects of her great personality. And theatricality is another big theme with Cukor because you know, he came from the theater and he adapted plays. A lot of his stories are about theater or theater people, or people, you know, like The Lawyers, Tracy and Hepburn playing Adam's Rib. The law is a very theatrical profession, and that film is really explicitly dealing with the law as a form of theater, and that becomes kind of a carnival atmosphere in the courtroom. And but it explores the gender roles. Pat and Mike, another wonderful film, is about sports, which is a form of performance. Of course, it is performance. And Hepburn is displaying her great athletic talents, and it's about a Pygmalion Galatea relationship where Tracy is her manager, and she's a feisty, independent, but somewhat insecure woman who wants to be respected by the man, and they work it out. So his work has certain themes that he does find and explore, but how he works with actors, you know, as I say, a great director doesn't have a formula that fits all. You know, you have to be a great psychologist. And one thing impressed me, you know, another reason I wrote about Cukor, I really love the guy. I mean, I met him, I interviewed him first in 1975 for the Directors Guild magazine when he'd come back from Russia making The Bluebird, which was a real disastrous experience for him. And I just want to read a funny thing he said to me. I was talking to him about what happens when you have mishaps or you get fired from a film. And I was thinking of a 1947 MGM film called Desire Me, from which he had been fired. And but Cukor leaned over the table. We were at the Polo Lounge of the Beverly Hills Hotel, and he leaned over and touched my forearm lightly with his right hand and leaned toward his publicist and said, notice with what finesse he avoids mentioning the title Gone with the Wind. Because he was famously fired from Gone with the Wind. And he survived. You know, he said that if other directors were fired, he would be the first to call them. Most people would shun them, but he would call them and say, I was fired from the biggest film ever made, and my career went on, and
Mm.
I recovered, and I'm doing well, and you'll be okay. And he was such a generous guy too,
Wow.
and he had a sense of humor and resiliency that I really liked. But I felt he kind of understood me as a kind of I was impressed by that. He said to me at that meeting, he said, "You're a very determined young man, but deceptively mild-mannered. Keep that." He said.
Oh,
I thought that was a very shrewd insight into aspects of my personality that most people never saw.
Wow.
And I was even directed by him by proxy. That year I was in The Wild Party, which is a James Ivory, Ismail Merchant film, which is based on the Fatty Arbuckle scandal. And the James Ivory told me, I was an extra in this film, a party guest, 1920s party. And James Ivory told me that when they were planning the film, he went to Cukor, he and Merchant went to Cukor and said, "How do we direct a 1920s Hollywood party?" And Cukor said, "Well, have your assistant director go around to every extra and tell the extra who you are and why you're at the party and something about your personality. And some people are not just a blobby mass, So when I did this scene, James Coco, playing this comedian, comes into the party, and the AD told me I was the son of a Hollywood studio executive, and I was sort of on the make to become a producer myself, and that gave me a hook, And so I decided to be kind of an aggressive, kind of social climbing fellow, and I reached over and grabbed Coco's hand as he was passing and shook his hand, and he smiled at me, and so then I asked Cukor, I said, "Is it true that James Ivory came to you and asked your advice?" He said, "Oh yeah, I told him that, So I think I was kind of directed by Cukor
That's funny.
by proxy in that film,
I mean,
But that gives a little clue to how he directed
yeah.
even a small bit person by long distance,
Mhm.
Everybody was important in
Yeah.
like in Capra's films too. Capra once said, "I treat every actor as a star, no matter how big or small the part." And Cooper did that too. He would pay attention to everybody and not neglect people, but he would tell them whatever they needed to hear. And he was very talkative and very intimate with his actors. I was on the set of his last film, Rich and Famous, for a day, and it was a little frustrating because he spoke very quietly to his two stars, Jacqueline Bisset and Candice Bergen. He was very private with them, and I couldn't really make out much of what he said, except when he would roll the camera, he'd say, "At a brisk clip, ladies, let's get on with it." He liked actors to pick it up, and Orson Welles had a funny line that he got from Michael McLean, where if an actor was taking too long to do a scene, he'd say, "Pick up your cloak and go." And that was kind of Cukor's thing. But there was one moment when Candice Bergen got a piece of direction that was very psychologically important. There's a beautiful shot of her toward the end. She's staging a New Year's Eve party, but she's kind of she's in another room looking on to the party. And she's kind of lost in thought because she wants to go see her friend somewhere else and leave the party. And Bergen wasn't sure what she was supposed to be looking at or whatever. And so she asked Cukor, and he said, "Look inside yourself." And I thought that was a great piece of direction, because when you see the shot, she's very introspective and she's thinking about her friend, and it comes across in the film. And so he always knew the right thing to say, and that was really important.
I mean, one of the things I'm getting from you is that it seemed like he took a real interest in human beings, in other human beings. He took an interest in you as just somebody who's just having a conversation with him, interviewing him, and he took an interest in his, in each, like Capra, as you're saying, in each role, like and wanting to give direction and story to each person. I think also that interest comes across in, as you put it, in the choice of the films. And here, just transition to Gaslight a little bit. So Gaslight is a film that comes out in 1944, but the choice, and now it was a play before this, but the choice to make a film about this, basically to bring this play to a much wider audience and to do it the way that Cukor does, feels to me incredibly progressive for the time, especially. In one that it's focusing, fixing our perspective on that of the female victim played by Ingrid Bergman. And it's just the whole thing, as you talk about actors, director, I mean, this whole film is like a chamber piece all built around just a few scenes that take place in these rooms where people are often shot, as I think you talk about this, with deep focus. So you get a lot of the staging of the people is incredibly important. And so that you can see everyone's faces as the dialogue is being exchanged. I think one of the most sort of interesting to me moments of this is the scene, which is actually a quite long scene that takes place in front of the fireplace between Paula and Gregory, and then the maid played by what's her name? Her name is Nancy. How did I miss Nancy?
Yeah.
Played by Angela Lansbury. And the three of them, the blocking of that scene is so fascinating because it's always with the intention of there's sort of something happening in the background and foreground simultaneously. You're watching all these characters interact. And again, I think the emphasis on the psychology of the characters and taking a sort of keen interest in those characters is always really crucial. But let me just say just briefly about Gaslight. So, and then we can jump into the film. Gaslight is the overall plot of the film is Paula Alquist, her aunt, is killed in her house when she's a young girl. She goes away and she's training to sort of be a singer in her aunt's footsteps. Her aunt's a very famous singer. And she's training in Italy. She meets Gregory Anton, played by Charles Boyer, and or Boyer. Sorry, I don't know.
Boyer.
Boyer. Thank you. It's my first time saying that name out loud. Charles Boyer, and and they fall in love, and then they go back, and he really wants her to go back to the townhouse that her aunt has left to her, and she initially resists, but then they go, and then what transpires is this incredibly toxic psychological manipulation perpetuated by Gregory on Paula, basically leaving her defenseless and without any other, friends or points of contact with the outside world. Well, then he basically slowly manipulates her. Well, basically, as we later learn at the end of the film, has been all along trying to find some jewels that were gifted to her aunt. And he finds them, but then is caught by the intrepid Brian Cameron, played by Joseph Cotton, inexplicably an American in London, who comes in and saves the day. But yeah, so that's Gaslight. And again, what I just wanted to say is just making this film in 1944, it seems like an act of, a very progressive action. In one of the ways in which it is that it highlights dramatically and dramatizes what seems to me to be a very real situation, one that existed then and continues to exist now, that of somebody who you become dependent on, then basically manipulating you and undermining your ability to think rationally for yourself. And when you're in that situation, it's just incredibly difficult to put words to describe it. Now we have a word for it. It's called gaslighting. But, at the time, there was no such word. And even harder, I think, to diagnose that situation because your sources of knowledge are so isolated and you have no way of getting out of it. So I just so curious now about Gaslight. For you, how do you feel the film fits into Cukor's overall career and connects up to broader themes in his filmography?
Well, it is a play, and it's written by Patrick Hamilton, came out in London, then it played Broadway. And there was a British film version in 1940, which unfortunately, as happened in those days, MGM, when they bought the rights, they tried to destroy the earlier film. And but they didn't manage to destroy all the prints, and one survived. And it's on the Blu-ray with Cukor's film, and it's an interesting comparison. It's a pretty good film too, but I think Cukor's is better. But Cukor talked a lot about creating a climate for his actors to inhabit, And you did a good job of describing his visual style in not only Gaslight, but in his work in general. You see not just, I mean, there's some great close-ups of Ingrid Bergman, who won an Academy Award, by the way, in this film. Tremendous lighting by Joseph Ruttenberg, light and shadow play on her face, and her sinister husband, Charles Boyer, has some real cold close-ups. And but the visual look of the film, the art directors won Oscars for this film. It's stunning Victorian claustrophobic setting, and she says at one point, "I'm afraid of this house. The house is like a character." It's kind of a horror film in a way. A lot of low angle shots, which from the floor upward, which show you the ceiling kind of pressing down on her, like in Citizen Kane, and all the bric-a-brac. It was very ornate bric-a-brac and furniture and everything kind of pressing in on this woman as she gets more and more trapped by her husband. And as you say, it's again, Cukor is ahead of his time, you could say, because he deals with what we call toxic masculinity, which is the power, talked about all the time. It's really about patriarchy and this man trying to control his wife for his own purposes. And it's actually about madness too, which is, there's a critic named Dan Callahan who wrote a good piece on Cukor and Senses of Cinema online, which I'd recommend. And he points out that Cukor is fascinated by madness, and that's one reason I like his work. Parenthetically, when I discovered his work with My Fair Lady, I was on weekend passes from a mental hospital when I was a high school kid. I had a physical and psychological breakdown when I was in high school. I went to a very strict Catholic school, and I wrote a book about this called The Broken Places. And my life was saved by a young woman who I met who was very disturbed, but a wonderful person, very smart, sophisticated. She was part Native American, really interesting, tormented young woman. But so I'd go and see My Fair Lady to see a kind of happier world. And I was just fascinated by this movie. And I really identified with Eliza Doolittle because my life was being changed by another person. And I also could relate to Henry Higgins, who it's somewhat similar to Gaslight because he's a very misogynistic philologist who trains this girl into becoming a lady, but it's more benevolent, even though he's a tyrant, because she goes along with it and she wants to be transformed. But there's a darker side to the Pygmalion story, and the dark side is really on view in Gaslight because he's a psychopath. This guy, he killed her aunt, and he's trying to drive her mad. But so it's a study of a person who actually is mad, and he's trying to drive somebody else mad. It's kind of a painful film to watch. I have to say, I just watched it again. It's mesmerizing, but really creepy, because Cukor gets into there aren't a lot of big set pieces like there are in some films, but it's kind of a slow accretion of details in her performance. And let me just tell you something. Bergman, when she was preparing to act in this film, Cukor suggested she visit a mental institution and study the patients. And she focused on one particular woman patient and her eyes. And she watched how the woman's eyes moved around right and left, in and out when she felt uncertain or wasn't sure what was happening to her. And you see that throughout this film. And John Ford, when he was asked, how do you watch a movie? He said, look at the eyes. The secret is people's faces, their eye expressions, their movements. And I interviewed an actress named Priscilla Bonner, who was in his 1926 film, Three Bad Men, very, very smart lady. And she said Ford told her the camera photographs your innermost thoughts and picks them up. If you concentrate, the camera can look into your innermost feelings. And that's so true. I teach screenwriting too, and I always say it's not just the dialogue that people speak, it's facial expressions, body language is so important. And Cukor excels in helping his actors with their movements. And Bergman has a wonderful dance where she gets kind of exhilarated all of a sudden and dances around the living room, and it's such a burst of freedom in the midst of this onerous situation. But the camera and the lighting, everything seems to be closing in on her, and it's all part of the visual world that he creates around the actors, and makes the feeling come alive for the actors.
Do you want to say your thing about Rebecca? Because I feel like that connects perfectly.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I don't know if you felt this way or if this rings true for you, but I couldn't stop thinking about Rebecca when I was watching this movie. And I mean, they're coming out in the same moment. I think that the book, the Daphne du Maurier book, comes out the same year as the Hamilton play. And then, of course, Hitchcock's Rebecca comes out the same year as the British version. 1940 is the same year as the British version of Gaslight. And they both, I mean, just on a purely plot basis, they both sort of feature younger women who have no living family, who have a whirlwind romance, and maybe their first sort of sexual encounter experience with an older man, and who is emotionally withholding, and then they find themselves in a house that's frightening, feels haunted, and surrounding by perhaps like the domestic laborers that seem to despise them, and they become increasingly isolated and no longer trust their own senses. And in the case of Rebecca, it's not so much her husband who's gaslighting her as maybe Danny, the maid, is playing with her a little bit, but he's also, she doesn't, by being so emotionally withholding and by not telling the full truth about his first wife, is sort of sending her to dark places as well. But I'm not sure. I read an article that just sort of mentioned that du Maurier's book comes out on the heels of a 1937 Matrimonial Causes Act in the United Kingdom, which finally made divorce more possible for women.
Oh yeah.
For cause. Previously men could list any cause at all for divorcing their wives, but women you'd have to prove, sexual abuse or something, the kinds of things that are virtually impossible to prove, particularly at this time. And they certainly could not divorce their husband for infidelity. And as of 1937, they could. Anyway, I just think it's interesting that it seems like this movie is a meditation too on the perils of intimacy and matrimony in a patriarchal setting, particularly where but more generally, how terrifying it is to enmesh your life with somebody else, your identity, your home with somebody else, and how very quickly the bottom can drop out from underneath that. I love both those movies. I love this movie.
Well,
that was my thought.
Yeah, I like the way you put it all in context, including the social context with the British law. And actually, I read about that in the book too, because Cukor directed A Bill of Divorcement in 1932, Katharine Hepburn's first film. And that was written by a British woman whose pen name was Clemence Dane. And it was propaganda for passing this more enlightened Divorce Act, which didn't exist at the time of the play that she wrote in the 20s, and as you say, was passed in the late 30s. And in that story, Hepburn's father is somewhat insane. John Barrymore plays the part, and she decides to kind of give up her life and become his caretaker. It's a very kind of sad film. But she worries about her own sanity. And again, it deals with that theme of madness. And yeah, Rebecca, you're right, very close parallel. And, when I watched Gaslight last night, again, I was thinking of Notorious too, because in Gaslight, Bergman becomes kind of like a sleepwalker. She's kind of looking around, and walking kind of in a daze when this man is really browbeating her and making her question her own sanity. And her affect and her movements and her dialogue, etc., become slowed down and kind of a dreamlike atmosphere. And that's what happens in Notorious, except she's drugged by her Nazi husband.
Right.
And Cary Grant has to come in and rescue her. And in this film, as you say, it's improbable that an American detective would be working for Scotland Yard, but in a melodrama like that, you do really feel good when a rescuer comes in to save her. And he's shrewd. But in the British play, the character was much more realistic. He was like a 60-year-old kind of ordinary bloke, detective, kind of salt of the earth character. But they wanted a love angle, romantic angle. And that's a bit of a flaw. And also David O. Selznick controlled both the contracts of Bergman and Cotton that had an effect on this. But you kind of go along with it. But Bergman's performance is in that vein of Rebecca. And, I talk in my introduction a lot about what is movie acting. I think movie acting is very misunderstood by people, that the parts that get Oscars and Emmys are usually given for what I call the most acting, not the best acting.
Mhm.
Right.
People who overact and scream and cry and wave their hands and put on disguises and accents, and but some of the best actors never get noticed. Like Cary Grant never won a competitive Academy Award, and John Wayne is my favorite actor. And I talked to him about people criticized him. They said, "You're playing yourself." Well, who the hell else should somebody play? I said, but I said to Wayne, I said on the set of The Shootist, he said, "Well, it's quite obvious it can't be done." He said, "If you play yourself, you'll be the dullest son of a bitch who ever walked across the screen." And he said, "What you have to do is act yourself and come up with a persona, where you create a persona." And that's what stars do. They create a persona that we want to see, that is wide enough to encompass different kinds of roles. And some people have more range than others. But Wayne said, "I only have one trick. I pause in the middle of the sentence so you don't look away, and I don't pause at the end of the sentence so you don't look away." But he also had that distinctive walk and his all that, and he learned that with the help of an actor named Paul Fix. And so Wayne constructed a persona, and that's what other actors do. And Cukor said what actors should do in films is just be rather than act. And Cukor would kind of do that, but then he worked with all kinds of people who were flamboyant characters. John Barrymore had a tendency toward hamminess, but he modulated that. And Rosalind Russell had never been playing a comical character until she did The Women. And she plays a hateful kind of character who breaks up a marriage, and she's very vicious. And she gave Cukor different ways of playing the scenes when they were rehearsing, and he said, "Do the funny part, the over the top funny absurdist thing," because he said otherwise they will really hate you, but if you're funny, they will enjoy your performance. And she said it gave her a whole new career. She played a lot of good comic parts after that. And so he could psychoanalyze actors and bring out the best. And he certainly did that with Ingrid Bergman. She was a superb actress, but she responded very well to his coaching. And it's funny, he would talk a lot to the actors, and she said at one point, "I'm not a dumb Swede. You don't have to keep telling me." He would tell the whole plot to her before every scene, like, "We're up to this point." And she said, I understand this stuff. And he said he felt inhibited for a few days, and then her performance seemed to suffer. So he thought, "What the hell?
Back to it.
I gotta go
back to the way I like to do it." And then she was fine. And
he's like, "Your name is Paola."
yeah. But I was thinking about that today. That's kind of what a director is for. He said the director is the audience, and Orson Welles said that's all the director is the audience. He supplies what's missing from the making of a motion picture, because in the theater you have the audience laughing or not laughing, but when you act in a film, the crew can't laugh or respond. They have to be poker faced. And what the director does also is keep the tone going the way that he or she thinks it should go, because each scene shouldn't be the same level of intensity, and that you modulate the rhythm of the shots and the scenes. And who's in charge of that? The director, working with the cinematographer. But blocking, as you mentioned, is so important to Cukor and other directors. Welles's blocking was astounding.
Oh,
actually.
totally. Of course. Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
I mean, on the acting, I think Ingrid Bergman is fantastic in this. And I think she's at her best in those moments when she's not necessarily saying any dialogue, but she's just there while other things are happening and she is reacting to it. Or there's just like two examples. I mean, one was the scene I mentioned where Nancy's flirting with Gregory in the back, and then Paula's foregrounded, and she's clearly overhearing their conversation, but
she's 3 feet away
and reacting, and well, it's actually unclear how far apart they are because of the deep focus. So you're like, I don't know.
Yeah, but like she can hear her husband being like, Nancy, you should give some makeup tips to my pale wife.
Totally. Totally. Yeah, totally.
A little coal on the fire, please, Nancy.
Very good, madam.
You're looking very pretty this afternoon, Nancy. You know that?
I don't know it at all, sir, I'm sure.
Tonight is your night out, isn't it?
That's right, sir.
Whom are you meeting tonight? You might like the guys too, Nancy. I see they've changed the policeman on the beat. Is his heart going to be added to the list of those you've broken?
I didn't know I'd broken any, sir.
Oh, no, I'm sure that's not true. And that complexion of yours, that's something that's not quite true either. Oh, you do it very cleverly, I grant you. In fact, I was wondering whether you might not care to pass some of your secrets on to your mistress and help her get rid of her pallor.
Sure, I'll be very pleased to do anything I can, sir. Will that be all you're wanting?
Yes, except tea when it's ready.
Very good, sir.
The other sequence where I think Bergman just really shines is the sequence where then they go to finally he relents and takes her out to the party. And they're at the party and he reaches for his watch and and you're just watching like she's enjoying the music and then just it all collapses and then he finds the watch in her bag and it's all just her reactions while this is happening. I think I guess there are a couple cuts because he's looking back at Joseph Cotten in the back, but either way, it's a lot of playing out in a kind of single, what did they call those? The name of the shot where it's just two people in the shot. Two shot. Yeah. There's a single two shot. And so, and I think she is just incredible at reacting in those ways because she has to be so passive and reactive. I mean, ultimately, because she's being led along by Gregory, who's much more active until the very end of the film when it turns. But yeah, I think Bergman is great.
I think, the danger in this play maybe could have been it could have been like two the same tone all the way through, but you need a lot of variation, and she supplies that with Kuiper's help. And you're right, many wonderful reaction shots. And John Wayne said, "I don't act, I react." That's part of a big part of acting. But the look in her eyes and her movements of the eyes, like I mentioned, where she was learning from this insane woman she studied, and the lighting is extremely subtle, but and creative geography, as they call it in films, and it is scary in a film where you don't quite know where one character is in relation to another. As you mentioned, it's a very interesting point because a lot of the scenes he doesn't start in the mechanical way with an establishing shot and move in. There's a lot of variation of how scenes are shot, and sometimes it's a higher angle, sometimes a lower angle, and it's really beautifully staged, and it's such a triumph of old studio craftsmanship. It's MGM at its best. They created this whole London atmosphere on a soundstage, including the exteriors.
And the Lake Como, I love that setting. They put all the fog, and I've never been to Lake Como. I don't think it looks like that. I don't know how it could. But like the way that he puts the extra mist in there, and it feels like they're the only people on this little like with their little boat that to come in and out. Like when she later says, like, I wonder now, like if I dreamed that time that we were together. It feels like he shoots it like a dream, and that's the one time her hair is down and tumbling. It's like the one time we see her happy, free, and not being actively molded. And
she even says, this was the first time I wasn't dreaming of or having nightmares of the thing that happened.
Right. And then, when she has a good relationship with the tutor, the singing tutor, but she's trying to be in her aunt's footsteps, and that he's trying to Pygmalion mold her into being an opera singer, and that's not going to work. And then she gets maybe she tries to go to Lake Como by herself, and then she almost escapes. And he shows up, and then a new kind of molding begins.
Yeah, she says late in the film when she's starting to realize what's being done to her psychologically by her husband, she said, "There's been nothing real from the beginning.
Yeah.
So it's very artificial in the best sense of the word. And Cukor believed in artifice, and theatricality and expressing characters. But later in his career, he went outdoors more often. In the 50s, he kind of was influenced by neorealism, and he shot films on the streets of New York. And he became kind of a European director in his old age, when he was kind of having trouble finding work in Hollywood. He directed Travels with My Aunt, which is a lovely film, really visually sumptuous. And Justine was a rescue job, but he created Alexandria, Egypt in the studio, and that was fascinating. But his visual style always kind of stemmed from the piece that he was trying to create. What is the mood and the feeling? And
Yeah, it looks very different than Philadelphia Story, for sure.
yeah, again, though, that's a very artificial film too. It's this mansion on the main line in Philadelphia, and almost all on the soundstage, and really atmospheric. And by the way, we should definitely talk about Angela Lansbury, because this is her first film, and she's a star from the first moment. She was a very young teenager. She was 17 when she did this film, and Cukor had this shrewd ability to recognize her talent. And as she said, I had it all there from the beginning, and I just needed somebody to bring it out. And she had never really acted. She had been in cabarets and things back in England, and she was wrapping packages in Bullock's department store for Christmas when Cukor, one of the writers, John Van Druten, brought her in and said, maybe you should interview her. And Cukor saw her unique qualities right away. She has this very kind of, she plays this very malevolent, flirty young maid who is putting the make on Charles Boyer, and he's, as you say, outrageously flirting with her in front of his wife to harass his wife. But also he's kind of intimidated by Lansbury. She's so strong, her formidable figure and the way she looks. And Cukor had to go to bat with the studio to put her in, because they said, is she sexy enough? And he said, yeah, come on. So she made an instant success and got an Oscar nomination, and her whole career was launched. And what a great career she had. She played Manchurian Candidate, one of the greatest performances ever in films. But she had a great stage career too. And but Cukor, again, was the guy who discovered her talent, and as he saw it was there, he could sense the qualities this young girl had, and helped her to relax and bring it out on screen. But he said from the very first scene that she did, she was all there. She was a star.
That's amazing. Was she your favorite, Laura?
No, I mean, what do you mean? Like,
I just of the big three,
of the three of them. No, I mean, I think it's Ingrid. I think it's a beautiful performance. I mean, Boyer is having a lot of fun.
Well,
too.
I was gonna say Boyer is my favorite.
Boyer is your favorite.
Well, because I think
Paola.
So I think he is. He has to play it very. He's got a difficult role. So because he knows the whole time what he's doing. But he can't reveal it to the audience until it's time to reveal it to the audience. And I went back and just scrubbed through the first 20 minutes of the film, and there are subtle signs that something is not right, but they're so subtle that it's very hard to pick up on in the first viewing. In fact, actually, we were watching for the first time, and I had no idea who was going to be the gaslighter. I did not know it was going to be him.
Really?
No, I was like, I don't know, maybe because I knew Joseph Cotton was in it, so I was like, maybe he's going to come in.
No, he's starting to play those games like, as soon as they're like, Como, he's like, oh, I have a dream. Oh, it's nothing.
Well, I don't know. I thought he plays it pretty subtly. I went back and rewatched it, and I was like, it's pretty subtle. Like he's
very subtle and low key. Cukor,
in the beginning,
like low key. Well, and sometimes Cukor encouraged big performances like Maggie Smith and Travels with My Aunt is really outrageously wonderful, But Boyer is very restrained. I've recently been seeing a number of his films. He's very different. His range is bigger than people think. For example, Hold Back the Dawn, a wonderful film that's Billy Wilder, Charles Brackett's script. I recommend that film. That's a great performance by Olivia de Havilland. And Boyer plays a gigolo who's trying to get into America. And I watched Meyerling, which is a terrific Anatole Litvak film about the Meyerling tragedy, and he's very romantic and kind of disturbed. And and Madame De, the great Ophuls film. Wow, I mean, what a great performance he gives as this cuckolded husband, a military man. You know, he's got such a range, Boyer, and but he plays it in very subtle, low-key ways. But he can be very different.
Yeah, and it's really critical too that when he's playing this game with her, he needs to keep her still engaged and in love, not just out of desperation, but he drops in these moments of tenderness.
Yes.
And that's critical to emotional abuse, right?
Yes.
Is like when you do give that love and that support that the other partner desperately wants. And he's very good at performing that, because I think if he was just like a mustache twirler, you know, as soon as they get to that house, it doesn't work.
No,
Because
not
you're
at
just
all.
like, girl, get out. This is even your house. Kick him out.
Well, the other thing is he's so good, and the script is really good, but he plays it perfectly of generating enough plausible deniability for the actions that he's doing. And I think that's the really like nefarious and sinister bit, is that he's able to, you know, there's this moment at, you know, he has these flashes of anger that come in. So he's very calm and collected, but then suddenly the letter comes out and he snatches it. And she's like, why are you so angry? And then he says, oh, it's just, I think like anything that reminds you of her is going to keep you so upset. And it's all about you. And he's able to have this like deniable claim to put it back on her. But then the other thing that he does, which I think is so sinister, is he lords his power over her at various points. So here's one point that I thought, I was just like, oh, this is just brutal. The busybody neighbor has come to the house and she wants to see them. And he says, no, you know, she's too sick. And Paula says, well, I actually would like to see her. And he's like, no, you're too sick. I don't want anyone here. Okay. And then afterwards, the maid goes and it tells her, we can't see you. And then she says,
Gregory, why did you do that? I would have liked to have seen her.
But my dear, I thought you were only trying to be polite. Why didn't you tell me you really wanted to see her?
Well, I couldn't be in front of that girl.
Oh, now you must get over this ridiculous fear of the servants. Now, if you really wanted to see her, all you had to say was sure I'd Nancy, wasn't it? Wasn't it?
And that's just so, it's such a, like, I'm just going to write just 5 seconds after it happened, just deny your agency and experience of what happened. I'm just going to say, like, what you thought happened, it didn't happen. You could have easily just said this. You didn't say it, even though she effectively said it, you know? It's so brutal.
Well, I was just thinking of something Frank Capra told me. He said, always give your villain his best arguments.
Yeah.
And that's I tell screenwriting students this, because if you have somebody who's a villain who's too obvious a villain or stupid or whatever, it's much better to make the villain seem kind of reasonable in some ways. But he's playing a game with her all the way through. But I mean, he's very sinister, but he's manipulating her in a very, that's what the word gaslighting has come to mean. And, you know, we've just been through, we're now into the whole Trump era again, where the whole country is being gaslit, I guess would be the word. But half the country is sort of enthralled to a cult, and cult leaders, have to have a kind of a mixture of seduction techniques and brutality. And you can't just be, well, I mean, you can, I suppose, be just a tyrant, but there's a kind of seduction and kind of cajoling and pretending to be jovial and warm and sweet and all that kind of stuff. And this film really masterfully gets into that. And the script is better than the play. The play is pretty good, but the characterizations are rather thin. But John Van Druten and Walter Reich wrote the script, and John Balderston. Van Druten was the playwright who, his play Old Acquaintance was filmed by Kubar as Rich and Famous, his last film. And Walter Reich was a terrific German refugee screenwriter who worked on Ninotchka. He was a friend and collaborator, Billy Wilder, So Cukor always had the best screenwriters. Donald Ogden Stewart wrote a lot of his films. Zoe Akins, Jane Murfin, Anita Loos, that's part of being a great director, is working with the best people, and you have to give them their reign, to let them do their thing. And Garson Kanin, Ruth Gordon, great screenwriters. He did several films with them, but the psychology of this film is so intricate and beautiful, but so much of it is expressed visually, as we're talking about, and pictorially. It's Joseph Ruttenberg was one of the great Hollywood cameramen who worked with Cukor on other occasions, and Cukor always worked with the best cinematographers, William Daniels and people like that, Leon Shamroy, the masters. He had them at his beck and call because they all respected him. He's, going back to why I wrote this book, he's not somebody who's lacking in respect. The Hollywood community respected him greatly, although he only won one Oscar. It's not really the measure of skill. Hitchcock never won a competitive Oscar, but Cukor won one for My Fair Lady, which I think is a great film. And it's, ironically, some of the cinephiles put that film down because they think it's, prepackaged material based on famous play and musical. But I think it's very personal to Cukor and very beautifully done. It's kind of the last gasp of the Hollywood studio craft, but he was well regarded, and his films usually got good reviews. But like a lot of veteran directors, he was kind of neglected as time went on. And after he made his greatest film, A Star Is Born, it was mutilated by Warner Brothers, unfortunately, and it's still great in its shorter version, but they hurt the film, and his career has kind of suffered from that. And he had a kind of a spotty record of what films became available later, but he still kept at it. He was when he turned he was 81 when he directed Rich and Famous, the oldest director ever to make a studio film in Hollywood up to that time. And I wrote an article about it for Variety, and he told me he was thrilled at that designation. It was so great to be working. Now Clint Eastwood just directed a film in '94.
Yeah.
Look at that. Warner Brothers threw away this very good film, Juror Number 2, and it's playing in a lot more theaters in Europe because they understand American films better over there. But Cukor has been undervalued, I would say, by critics and historians who haven't. The literature on him is relatively scarce compared to, say, Hitchcock or Ford or other directors from that era. There are a few books. Pat McGilligan's biography, A Double Life, is very good, and there's an anthology of essays on his films. But there isn't the voluminous literature that he really merits. So, but I think by doing this experimental look at a director through the actors, it gives us a way of really understanding his unique qualities. But when I wrote about the actors, I found I also had to analyze the films in detail too, and how he worked with the writers and the material. And but I come at it through, okay, what are the actors showing us? And Capra said, film faces the audience with a single thin front line, the actors, and they're the people that the audience goes to see. Most people go because, okay, let's go see a John Wayne movie or Katharine Hepburn movie or whatever. And most people probably never heard of George Cukor. I mean, I report a poignant anecdote. When he got up to accept Katharine Hepburn's Oscar for Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, Sidney Poitier was handing out the Oscar, and Cukor said to him under his voice as he walked up onto the stage, "Will you please tell them who I am?" Just kind of poignant. And then Poitier mispronounced his name, and the announcer mispronounced his name too. It's Cukor, not Kukor or Cukor. People still mispronounce his name, which is kind of a symptom of something.
There it is.
He should be a household name.
Yeah.
And that's what we like to do. I mean, I feel as a critic and historian, I try to redress imbalances and injustices, either write about people who are neglected or misunderstood or undervalued, or John Ford was once asked in the '30s by an interviewer, "Do you like to make films about subjects that make you angry?" And he said, "What the hell else does a man live for?" I always think that about. I like to, to write about things that made me indignant. Like, why isn't George Cukor better known? Why don't people know what Sylvia Scarlett is? Why haven't they? Why don't they look at Travels with My Aunt more often? And why do they undervalue My Fair Lady? I get indignant, and you need that energy to drive you when you write a book. But I've been loving his work for decades, and trying to, I thought it was a challenge for me personally because I felt I had failed. I wrote a piece on him. When was this? Around the late 80s, I guess, a long career piece. But I didn't quite feel I had cracked the code of his DNA, of his work. So that I felt I had a challenge remaining. And I hope that George Cukor's people will rise to that in people's minds when they read it and drive them to see the films.
Yes, absolutely. Well, the book is George Cukor's People Acting for a Master Director. Thank you very much for being here, Joseph. This is truly it's an excellently written book, and
we have so much homework to do now.
I mean, it's really
homework.
Wonderful, and we should just say for the people at home who cannot see this, but we're talking to you over Zoom, and behind you we have a signed photograph of Cukor talking to Francois Truffaut, and there you are with a cigar in your hand, it looks like.
Yeah. This was 1975 at the AFI premiere party for Truffaut's Story of Adele H. And Cukor loved Truffaut's work, and Truffaut loved Cukor's work, and I was privileged to eavesdrop on their chatting together. And Cukor was in his later years, he would always host the Academy Awards. He would have a luncheon at his home for the people who made the foreign film nominee films. He would have them over to his house, and there's some wonderful pictures of these foreign directors like Buñuel and other people meeting John Ford and George Stevens and Billy Wilder. He was a real cosmopolitan and an ambassador for the best in American filmmaking too. So, well, I hope that you. Which Cukor films have I inspired you to see?
I mean, I will definitely the ones you mentioned that you love. So My Fair. I mean, I have
to see A Star Is Born.
Star Is Born for sure. I've actually never seen My Fair Lady. What? I have a huge gap. I mean, and Cukor is a huge blind spot for me, as is like all of Indian films.
No, it's okay. It's okay.
But yeah. So yeah, I think many, but I think we will definitely start with A Star Is Born and then go from there. Yeah.
I think that's one of the maybe 20 best films ever made. And my friend Ron Hayward, his big dream was to reconstruct the cut version. He did find some missing pieces of it and put it back together with some stills, and you have a more closer approximation of this really great film. But I'd strongly recommend Sylvia Scarlett if you haven't seen that.
Yes, that's also been added to my list since we were reading this book. It's funny, I didn't realize how much Cukor's tendrils had been in like all the things that were important to me as a kid, like Wizard of Oz, which I now found out was like Judy Garland, who will later be in that Star and Star Is Born with him, like was styled, was like he influenced like not putting her in a giant blonde wig and makeup and making her look like a teenage girl, like herself. I idolized Dorothy when I was a kid, and then I idolized I loved My Fair Lady, and I would then when I got older I was fascinated by Katharine Hepburn in Philadelphia Story and how she is playing with gender and their expectations around that in that movie, more not obviously as obviously as in Sylvia, but it's coming through in a way that captivated me. So yeah, it's funny. I did not realize that Cukor was there the whole time when I was loving movies and trying to figure out myself.
Well, that's really great because I mean, every cinephile probably has a few Cukor films that they love, like you mentioned some right there. Yep. And but then they sometimes they don't know the name, but you say he did this and this and this and this. And by the way, it hasn't come up in the interview, but just to say to people, because he's known as a woman's director, this was they promoted this in publicity, et cetera, but it's a limiting thing. And he would get kind of exasperated by that over the
Yeah.
years because he directed so many great male performances like Spencer Tracy several times, Cary Grant, John Barrymore, James Mason, it goes on and on. He was just a great director of people. So I call it George Cukor's People partly for that reason, but I also, the epigraph for this book was Katharine Hepburn said to Cukor, "You never had to put a label on the bottle because it was unmistakable. All the people in your pictures are as goddamn good as they can possibly be, and that's your stamp." So I'll let her have the last word.
That sounds great. Thank you very much for being here, Joseph. And everyone should check out the book, George Cukor's People.
Thank you, from Columbia University Press.
Yes.
And you can pick it up early December. It's coming out. So I hope people read it and enjoy it and see his films.
Pre-order
Thank you
now.
for having me. It's wonderful to talk to you about this.
Thank you. Bye, Joseph.
Bye.
Have a good night.
We are at Cowspod on Twitter. You can find us on the web at cowspod.com. In 2 weeks, we'll be talking to Dan Harris, returning guest, about Home Alone.
Hell yeah.
So we're doing that and then following it up on Christmas with 3 Grinch movies with Emily St. James. So look forward to that. It's a Christmas time in December. We'll see you guys soon. Bye.